Welcome back, everyone. We are wrapping up our section on cardiorespiratory exercise by looking at how you can develop your own training program. So, we mentioned the FIT protocol when we were looking at fitness principles, and we're going to look at each of these variables in a little bit more detail as they apply to cardiorespiratory exercise. Again, FIT stands for frequency, intensity, time, and type. So, first, frequency. A reminder, the US Physical Activity Guidelines recommend that adults exercise an average of 30 to 60 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity 5 days a week, or 15 to 30 minutes of vigorous intensity physical activity 5 days a week. That's how these guidelines shake out, plus 2 days of muscle strengthening and balance challenge. We'll look at that later. But we're looking at, again, somewhere between half an hour to an hour most days a week of moderate intensity, or let's say 15 to 30 minutes of vigorous intensity physical activity. We're trying to get into that consistent habit of getting some exercise in most days per week, and the intensity can vary. So let's see, do US adults meet these physical activity guidelines? As I mentioned before, not so much. So this is data from 2008 to 2016. And first, when we're looking at adults, if they're meeting both the aerobic and resistance training guidelines, we see that just over 20% of men do in that time period, and just under 20% of women do. And when we look over at high school students from 2011 to 2015, we see quite a bit more discrepancy here. So we see that for boys, around 30% meet these guidelines, and for girls, a little over 10%. So you can think about as to why there may be this variation in boys and girls in high schools, why boys may be getting more physical activity, and that's certainly an issue that needs to be addressed. So we want to be increasing the levels of physical activity. And if you're not meeting those minimum guidelines we mentioned, 150 to 300 minutes a week of moderate physical activity plus 2 days of resistance training, what can we do to add that in? So we're looking at developing this FIT protocol for cardiorespiratory training. So we already said, okay, looking at ideally somewhere around 5 days a week, let's say 3 to 5. If you're doing the vigorous intensity, maybe you're doing fewer days. If you're doing longer bouts, maybe you're doing fewer days, but somewhere in there. And again, walking counts. So whatever you can get in a day. How are you going to measure your intensity? So we mentioned vigorous intensity requires less amount of time compared to moderate intensity, which requires a greater amount of time. So here are a couple different ways that you can measure intensity, and you're going to need to do this in your next assignment, hint, hint. So I want to cover a few of these. Let's start by heart rate. This is the traditional measure. So you can use a wristwatch and a chest strap to monitor your heart rate. Outside of elite or competitive athletes, those who do races or specific sports, most folks probably don't use a heart rate monitor on a regular basis. If you're just kind of a recreational athlete or a recreational exerciser, it may not be something you're using. However, you can look at a percentage of your estimated max heart rate, estimated because this is not necessarily a measured number, unless you've gotten this measured in a lab, and then you can determine moderate or vigorous intensity from there. So let's use the traditional formula. There are some other formulas, but this is the most straightforward one of 220 minus your age times the percentage of heart rate that you're looking for. That's how you get target heart rate, where max heart rate is 220 minus age. So let's say you are 20 years old. We will then assume that your maximum heart rate is 200 beats per minute. And that would be when you're pushing exercise to a maximal intensity. So again, there's going to be a margin of error. One standard deviation is about 12 beats per minute in either direction. So just based on genetics, you might have a higher resting heart rate or a lower resting heart rate, and that will adjust your max heart rate. But for convenience sake, this is what we'll look at here. From there, you would take a look at the percentages of max heart rate for moderate and vigorous exercise. So for moderate exercise, it's 65 to 75% of heart rate max. Vigorous exercise is considered 76 to 96% of heart rate max, with the above being very vigorous. So let's say you have determined that you want to work at the top end of moderate intensity exercise, so 75% of heart rate max, and you are 20 years old. So we would take 220 minus age. Now you are left with 200 as your max heart rate, and then you times that by 0.75 or 75%, which would give you a heart rate of 150 beats per minute as your target heart rate. So again, unless you're doing some sort of race training, threshold training, where you're looking to improve your speed or endurance for a specific race or outcome, then this may not be necessary for you. There are two other ways that you can subjectively assess exercise intensity that may be more useful. One is the perceived effort method. And this is you monitoring how hard it feels on a 0 to 10 scale. The scale is referred to as the Borg RPE scale, rate of perceived exertion. So this simple to use one is the 0 to 10 scale, where moderate exercise is somewhere around a 3-4. So 1 or 2 might be like a light walk or just kind of getting up and moving about the house. 3-4 feels moderate to somewhat hard, maybe a brisk walk or a moderate paced swim or jog. Vigorous exercise would be somewhere between a 5 and a 7, so hard to very hard. And then very vigorous exercise or near maximal effort would be that 8, 9, 10. Those would be really only very short intervals that you could sustain. Thinking back to when we covered our energy systems, bioenergetics, and how they pertain to different modes of exercise. So again, if you're trying to get that moderate intensity physical activity, let's say you're going out for a walk, 30 minutes, 5 days a week, you're looking for that somewhat hard, moderate to somewhat hard, 3-4. If you're going to go for a run or try to find some more vigorous intensity, you're looking for that 5 to 7. So that subjective rating can be used. Another great way to do this is through the talk test. And this will gauge exercise intensity based on your ability to talk easily, to carry on a conversation. And this is dependent on your rate of respiration during different intensities of exercise. So here are a couple things to consider. We're going to look at light, moderate, and vigorous intensity exercise. With light exercise, you could talk, you could even sing a song or recite a lecture like I'm doing right now. I could probably very casually walk and carry on this conversation. If you are in moderate exercise, moderate intensity exercise, you can talk, but you can't sing a song. So you might need to pause every sentence or two to take a deep breath, but you could still carry on a conversation. So that moderate exercise, level 3-4, think of it like a brisk walk or a light jog. Vigorous intensity exercise is you can only give a few words at a time, such as, let's run that way, or turning right up ahead. You're not going to be very easily able to carry on a long conversation. That's going to be somewhere between our 5, 6, or 7. And then if you're in that very hard, very intense max effort range, you're probably not going to be able to talk at all. So the two areas to know are moderate, you can talk but not sing. Vigorous, you can't hold a conversation. So that's a really easy and relatively valid and reliable way to assess exercise intensity. So when you're planning out your programming, if you're looking for moderate intensity for you, you're going to be able to hold a conversation. If you're looking to sprinkle some vigorous intensity or maybe vigorous intensity intervals, you want to get to a place where you can only say a few words at a time. All right, let's look at the 2 T's now, time and type. So time is the duration of individual exercise sessions. Now, there's one change that they made to the 2018 physical activity guidelines, and this is that there's no minimum requirement for your exercise session to count. So it used to be, cardiorespiratory exercise was considered as bouts of 20 minutes or more. And then they said even things as little as 10 minutes count. And now it's kind of like, get it in where you can fit it in, right? So if you can only take breaks for 5 minutes at a time throughout the day to go up and down a flight of stairs, let's say you do that 5 times, that's 25 minutes, right? So wherever you can fit it in. And you know the guidelines for throughout the week. I'm not going to repeat them to you again, but we're looking for about 30 to 60 minutes of that moderate intensity most days per week. And again, I'll repeat that the type or modality is any which you enjoy. So we're looking at cardio here, whether that's swimming, walking, running, stair climbing, ellipticaling, erg biking, Zumbaing, dancing, skateboarding, surfing, you name it. Whatever you enjoy, do it. It's going to increase the consistency and the likelihood that you're going to keep up with it. And last thing here, when it comes to type, we can look at steady state, often referred to as steady state exercise or moderate intensity continuous training versus interval training, sometimes referred to as high intensity interval training. And lots of times folks love to gravitate towards the HIIT, the high intensity interval training. They think they'll achieve better benefits, better outcomes when it comes to improvement in physical fitness. And this is not necessarily true. Most of the research, the body of research on this suggests that folks can achieve similar improvements in things like VO2 max or fat loss or body recomposition from steady state or high intensity interval training. Again, the most important thing is if you enjoy it enough to keep doing it. So the benefit of high intensity interval training is that often it takes less time, right? You saw that the requirements for vigorous intensity are less. So with a sufficient warm up, which we'll cover in a minute, maybe you do 5 or 6 bouts of very hard 15 or 30-second intervals with a minute in between of recovery of moderate intensity. And so it only takes you 15 minutes or 20 minutes to get your whole workout in. Whereas with steady state, you may need to do something at a lower intensity for 30 or 45 minutes. So if you have a shorter amount of time, you like that intense, sweaty, more breathless feeling, go for it. Do interval training. There are plenty of apps and strategies to find a way to do that. If you prefer, you have a longer amount of time and you prefer the lower steady state intensity, you're going to enjoy it more. You're going to do it. You're going to go rollerblading with a friend or walking with a friend, then stick with the steady state, right? Whatever kind works for you and fits into your lifestyle. A few other considerations. An important thing to consider is appropriate warm-ups and cool downs. So when it comes to cardiorespiratory training, a warm-up is just a gradual increase in intensity. So that's speed or grade. So maybe you start walking or jogging for 5 to 10 minutes or, climbing or whatever you're doing at a lower intensity of about 5 to 10 minutes to let your cardiorespiratory system start to respond. And then similarly, a cool down will be about 5 to 10 minutes as well of a decrease in intensity to come back to homeostasis or baseline. Now, when we're looking at resistance training in the next section, not only will you include some sort of global cardio warm-up general, where you're moving maybe for 5 minutes, even doing things like marching, jumping jacks, high knees, etc. But you're also going to include some sort of dynamic stretching and movement prep. So dynamic stretch would be moving again joints through the full range of motion. And I do have some video examples for you here. And then movement prep might be activating specific muscles. So with exercises like glute bridges to activate the glutes or planks or dead bugs to activate the core and doing the exercises that you're going to perform at a lighter weight. So for resistance training, we have both that general cardiorespiratory warm-up for maybe 5 minutes, and then maybe another 5 to 10 minutes of dynamic stretching, muscle activation, and movement prep. And then cool down is the same thing for both. You're just gradually decreasing the intensity to bring the body back to homeostasis. Let the heart rate, the blood pressure, the body temperature come back down. And the reason this is so key is it helps bring you back to a parasympathetic nervous system state. This, if you remember, is your rest and digest component of your nervous system. This is helpful for repair, recovery, all the things that we want to do after we finish exercise. Additionally, exercise is a stressor on the body. Life is full of stressors coming at us. So this can be a great place to take a couple of minutes to bring it back down, decompress, activate that parasympathetic nervous system so we're not always in that revved up sympathetic state throughout the day. Hydration. Hydration is another key. So overall hydration and workout hydration. This is going to vary quite a lot by your body size, the type of food that you eat, the amount of activity that you do, the environment that you live in, whether it's hot and humid, you're going to need more, right? So general recommendations, the National Institutes of Health recommends that men on average get 3.7 liters per day, women get 2. So that's 11 to 15 cups. A cup is like this much. Think of a little coffee cup. Not a full glass, 8 ounces in a cup, okay? So throughout the day, low sugar liquid beverages like water, coffee, and tea actually count, and foods. Think of something like watermelon. And then babies, children, and elderly are at greater risk of dehydration because of poor thirst mechanisms. So those are kind of basic guidelines. Again, there's no perfect number. It's going to vary a little bit for everyone. But when it comes to hydration for exercise, there are a few additional considerations. You do want to replenish any weight lost through hydration. And I say this for 2 reasons. 1, so you're hydrating enough. 2, so you know that you do not lose fat weight in an individual exercise session. So sometimes folks like to weigh themselves before they exercise and after. And if the weight on the scale goes down, they go, "Ooh, good, I lost some weight." but it is not the kind of weight you want to lose. You lost weight via sweating, that's just water, and that's actually dangerous to your health and performance. So you want to replenish that after exercise. So let's say the weight's gone down a pound. You want to get 16 to 24 ounces or 1 to 1.5 of the amount of water weight that you lost. Otherwise, you should be sipping water throughout an exercise session, roughly 7 to 10 ounces every 15 minutes, but you don't need to measure it out. Drink to your thirst and ensure you're optimally hydrated beforehand. So if you're working out first thing in the morning, drink something first. If you're working out on a hot, humid day, make sure you've been hydrating throughout the day. Okay. Don't go into a session dehydrated, and drink something 15 minutes every 15 minutes or so throughout exercise. What about added carbohydrates and electrolytes? So when do you need something like a glucose solution or Gatorade or Powerade? The rule of thumb is if it's exercise for under 60 minutes, no exogenous carbohydrates are needed. You don't need extra sugars or carbohydrates when you're exercising for that time period. If it's going to be 60 to 90 minutes or more of hard exercise, more moderate to vigorous intensity exercise, especially performance-based or when preparing for performance, then adding additional carbohydrates can help. So this doesn't mean, oh, I'm going to go out for a walk with my friend for an hour and a half. You don't need to add Gatorade in. But if you're going for a 90-minute run or a longer distance kayak or swim or something that's going to be over 60 minutes and that's going to get into that more intense training, then you would want to add 30 to 60 grams of exogenous carbohydrates per hour. So that can look like Gatorade, that can look like Powerade, that can look like goo or gel. And this becomes even more performant for those who compete or plan to compete. And then what about electrolytes, sodium, potassium, etc.? Do you need these? It depends. The answer so often when it comes to physiology is it depends. So it depends on how much salt or electrolytes you're getting in your food throughout the day. It depends on how hot or humid the climate is. Again, it depends on how long you're exercising. If you're in a very hot and humid climate, it couldn't hurt. If you're going to sweat a lot, you may sweat. You're going to sweat a lot. You're going to sweat out some electrolytes as well. And you will actually rehydrate faster in the presence of electrolytes. Sodium being a key one here. So that can be helpful. If you know you're exercising in the summer or places where it's hot and humid, adding additional electrolytes may be helpful. And let's say you're going to be exercising or even outside for a long period of time. It's really hot and humid and you're drinking throughout the day. It can actually be dangerous to get insufficient electrolytes when you're drinking, if you're hydrating well throughout the day. So let's say you're going out for 18 holes of golf and you're going to be out there for a couple hours and it's hot and humid and you're just throwing back water. This is a time when you would want to be adding back the electrolytes that you're losing in your sweat. So again, electrolytes, maybe depending on the heat and humidity, carbohydrates only for more intense exercise beyond an hour, especially with a performance goal in mind. Other things to consider. I don't have a bullet here, but nutrition. We'll talk a lot more about nutrition, but should you eat before you work out? Again, it depends. So is it okay to work out fasted? Sure. Is it okay to work out with food in your stomach? Absolutely. So again, it depends on your goal, your timing, your lifestyle. If you work out first thing in the morning, you wake up at 5 or 6 and you just want to hit the gym and get it done, or go out for a run and get it done, it is okay to exercise fasted if you feel okay. You may not hit optimal intensity. So if you're looking to lift like a maximal load or to reach maximal speed for varying sprint intervals, you're not going to be as powerful if you haven't eaten before. If you're looking just to get a good workout in to improve your health and fitness, it can be okay. However, also pay attention to, if you don't eat before, do you feel hungrier throughout the day? If you do eat before, do you feel hungrier throughout the day? Do you notice that some athletes will say they feel sick or nauseous if they don't eat before? However, if you are an athlete getting a lot of activity in throughout a day, especially multiple bouts, it is probably a good idea to get some simple carbohydrates and protein in before you exercise. But again, if it's just a single bout of exercise, it's not maximal intensity, you're not looking for maximal performance output, it's okay to go into it without food. If you're looking for maximal performance output, you want to ensure that you have some easy to digest carbohydrates and protein in your system first, minimizing fiber and fats. And that's kind of all there is to say for now on food. Appropriate clothing and footwear. So probably something that many of you are aware of, but again, just to be safe, closed-toed shoes. So not exercising in sandals, open-toed shoes, sneakers with some sort of non-slip sole. So you're not slipping in the gym or outside. Sometimes we forget these things. And then appropriate clothing, gym wear, typically cotton or some sort of wicking material, and that you can layer, take on or off depending on the weather, free of like zippers or other things that will snag. So definitely appropriate clothing and footwear is helpful and important. And then this last thing I have here is planning and prep link for you. And this takes you to xrx.net, which is a silly kind of old-fashioned looking website that is chock full of research-backed recommendations around exercise and training. And why I wanted to bring this to you here is a lot of people are like, I just don't know where to start. And it can be really difficult to start without taking a class or seeing a trainer if you have no background. And so they have programs for new exercisers. So we're looking at cardio right now. So if you come in here and come to aerobic conditioning, they have programs, walking programs, walk jog programs, marathon programs, interval training, cycling, etc. So half marathon levels 1, 2, and 3. They also have a ton of resistance training programming here. It's awesome. So develop a workout, logs, templates, instructions. They have training, safety recommendations, protocols for different exercises. They have some pretty sound nutrition information, fitness testing. So this is a useful resource. I have it linked for you here in the PowerPoint that you can use if you would like to developing your program. And lastly, our basic takeaways. Again, we're looking for 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity or 75 to 100 minutes of vigorous intensity throughout the week. Looking at more days per week, the better. 2 days of resistance training. Start gradually, build from there, considering frequency, intensity, and duration. Start with frequency, then add in the intensity and duration. Use the talk test to determine your intensity, aiming for somewhere in that moderate to vigorous zone. Remember that consistency is key, and the best way to be consistent is to find exercise that you enjoy. Take care.